All right, so we are at session 2 now, the distortion of the civil sphere. And we're also going to be in the text of Scripture for this as well. And again, a lot of 101 stuff, but we'll make some connections. First, let me have you turn to Genesis chapter 11. Genesis chapter 11. And I actually got this question pretty recently too. What was so wrong with what they did at Babel? I mean, they were just getting together to, heart emoji. They were just getting together. The world. We are the world. That kind of thing. And just have no clue what's wrong with it. Maybe this isn't over. And they wouldn't say, well, maybe God overreacted. Or isn't that a good thing to get people together and have a common language and culture? Why is that a bad thing? Okay, fair enough. Fair question. So let me read the text first, and then we'll look at it. Genesis 11, verses 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and they all have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of the whole earth. So I think we can make a short list of things that were wrong here. And this comes right from the text. Draw a tower over here. I know, more bad artwork. And doesn't look like this anyway, because it was a ziggurat and it looked totally different. But it was all the way to the heavens. You see the language there. And I'm going to list just a couple of things that are wrong here and the significance of these things. Number one, there was an alternative religion. Alternative and competing religion. We know what that is now, the chief deity over there, Marduk. And another reason we know that from secular history, Babel, the other name for it is the gate or the gateway of the gods. But it's in the text anyway. In the text it says, let us build a tower, what? That reaches the heavens. And that's symbolic. Okay? Beyond that, they said, let us make a name for ourselves. What was man created to do from the beginning? He was to make a name for God. He was to be for God's glory and not his own name. Then it says they all came and they collected. In other words, he said, well, what's wrong with that part? They came together. They all collected. Well, in parentheses, not filling the earth. What was another thing that they were told to do back in the garden? To fill the earth and subdue it. To go that way. See, again, not getting it yet still. But the whole thing, and you can even see this in the divine words, was a reversal of the curse. And it's somewhat similar. By the way, there's a lot of anthropological language there. If there's anybody watching and maybe you're not a Christian and you're maybe just catching it on the side of, God looked and then he came down and he said, let us. Well, okay, that's called an anthropomorphism. That is God revealing himself in the form of a man. Okay, that's where that word comes from. And it's just to make something that would ordinarily be very difficult that our puny minds couldn't handle. And he's showing it to us in a way that we can. He doesn't need to get a better view. In fact, there's even a little bit of poetic sarcasm in him looking down on their little anthill that he's going to get ready to squash. Okay, so there's a lot going on there that'll explain that. But when he says that nothing they do now, nothing that they propose to do, they will stop. okay? And he's not sweating. That's not the point of it. He's making the point about what we're going to see coming out of Babel. And we're just going to put Babylon, yes, that is where that spot is in the plains of Shinar, and it becomes that place, which, by the way, was the center of where the Garden of Eden was. Remember the 4 rivers. 2 we can't identify. Scholars debate it. The other 2 are the Tigris and Euphrates. And this becomes the spot of the historical Babylon, but this becomes both the type and then the antitype Babylon in Revelation. And what's happening here, when we put it all together, we'll see, is an Antichrist utopianism. I preached a sermon on this once and talked about these kind of things happening. And I got some reaction by somebody afterwards, and this is more than 10 years ago now. Say, oh, I believe all that's true. I just don't see it in the text. And that's a normal way. It's kind of the way we all read the Bible, sort of inductively, just sort of looking only at the word level and not the concept level. But of course we get this we bring in all parts of Scripture that talk about this thing. And this thing in this case is Babylon. Babylon becomes, in addition to being an enemy of the Jews, and they kind of play the role of Pharaoh again in Nebuchadnezzar and taking them exile in the Babylonian captivity. But then later in the New Testament, Babylon becomes a euphemism even for Rome. But really, it's even bigger than that. But we see that at the end of Peter's letter, in 1 Peter 5:13, where Mark, as his amanuensis, his secretary, writing for Peter, says she who is in Babylon greets you. She, the church, in Babylon. You're like, Peter wasn't in Babylon. He's writing from Rome. Yes, I know. And if you read in Revelation, you'll see the same thing. That Babylon is used as a euphemism for Rome, which itself is a symbol for this world order of the secular view. Secular just meaning this time and this place. In and of itself, it's not a bad thing. But when you pull it away from God and oppose God, and that's really what we're going to see in this distortion of the civil sphere. God judged this utopian spirit. And in the same act of judgment, where he confuses the language, he scatters the people, it's also an act of common grace, somewhat similar to what he does to Adam and Eve. Let's keep them away from the tree of life. Again, he wasn't sweating there. It was all symbolic for our purposes. The angel with the flaming sword, lest they reach out and live forever. Here, too, there's an old saying. Good fences make good neighbors. At first, the question, what was so wrong with Babel, is an understandable question. But what we see behind it is a false assumption about unity and about projects that would ordinarily and originally be good, but are attempts to build the city without its true king, and to reverse the curse on our own steam. Now, we're going to look at a couple of sins of not only the kings, but really all the offices, and those all teach us something. Now, I'm going to try to leave all that there. I'll take this out, but I'll have kind of a storyline. You remember that I mentioned Deuteronomy 17. And I said, hold that thought. And I said, I'm going to draw a beeline between Deuteronomy 17 and 1 Samuel 8. So why don't you turn now to 1 Samuel 8. And I'm going to have to contract this line once I get there, but that's fine. For now, turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8. And remember, and have in your minds as I read this text, those offices of Israel in Deuteronomy 17, and that they were under law. If you look at 1 Samuel 8, there's a complaint against Samuel because of his sons And starting at verse 1, it says, "When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn son was Joel, the name of the second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. Yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice." By the way, you should always just tear and just swing the axe at the root of God's tree whenever somebody fails or they have a bad moral character. So they just toss out God's whole law because of it and lose your mind. That's sarcasm. You should totally never do that. But that's what they did. And it says, "Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, 'Behold, you are old and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations.'" You say, okay, I already pinpointed their sin there. Well, that's true. That's true, but there's actually more to it. Starting in verse 6, "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, 'Obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them.'" And I'm not going to read the ways of the king, but he's going to abuse them in this way and that way and that way and that way. And there's a wrong lesson to take from that. There's a way to reduce that. But just a couple of things. Yes, it is true. Their plea and their motive, "Give us a king to judge us like all the other nations." Yes, we correctly identify that as a sin. But there's more to it. Notice in verse 7 first. "Obey the voice of the people." And then he says it again. Do you remember back in the law, in Deuteronomy especially, you hear this, that God tells the people to listen to the voice of Moses? Because in listening to the prophet and all the commandments that I command you today, they were listening to God. But now he says to the prophet, obey the mob. Interesting. The reversal of truth source in the reversal of the form of government. I've heard it said many times that the Bible offers no form of government. I beg to differ. That it doesn't warn us against bad forms of government. I beg to differ. When you obey the voice of the mob, then your standard, your benchmark for moral truth, and in fact all truth, as Socrates and Plato could have told you. And that was what was going on in the Apology. And that's why Plato hated democracy. And that's why all political theorists who are worth their weight in anything we still read warned against democracy and called it names like mobocracy. We'll have more to say about that. But obey the voice of the people. And so democracy in politics begets a democracy of truth, as right is reduced to the majority. You say, one has nothing to do with the other. Because again, you're treating politics as something amoral, as something dirty. No, we're talking about God's law about an object, the image of God. And that's totally moral. In fact, it's the root of morality. It's the center of what we mean by morality. If you have majority vote on those questions, you're not simply guilty of the ad populum fallacy in logic. You're guilty of replacing God as your king with a new God. Not just a new king, a new God. The people. There's a rejection of God in their rejection of form. And that's the second thing that we need to see here. Not just is there a shift in truth as there a shift in form of government, but in that shift of form of government, there is a rejection of God as king over them. They have rejected me from being king, God says in verse 7. And so you see those two things in the mouth of God himself to Samuel. And so moving from a republic to a democracy reduces the origin of law and it reduces the object of law. No longer is it the image of God upheld through the law, but now it is simply the vote. There's the famous phrase, I was going to wait for it, but I think it fits perfectly here. I don't know if it was Benjamin Franklin or somebody else, but he defined democracy as what? 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. And just substitute human beings there. And that is a different object of law in addition to the different origin of law. Now you might say republic, and you might not have been there for the first lesson. I'm going to unpack this more and more in each session. By republic, we're not speaking primarily of representation. There are representative republics, but that's not primarily what the word means. By republic proper, all we mean in the Latin, res publica, the public thing, or in other words, the objective thing. People even butcher the etymology because that's all they look at is the etymology. They don't look further at political theorists in what they're really honing in on. It's not simply that it is of the public interest or a public matter. Of course it is. But what makes it a public interest and public matter? It is that there is an object that God calls his image. And law is there to protect the image. Therefore, the vote, if you have it at all, is there because the law is there, because the image is there. If you reduce that order, you not only don't worship God, but you hate your fellow man. Because you exalt the mob or the opinion, whatever it is, over the whole point. That is what republic means. The objective thing. We'll get back to that. We'll talk about it in great detail in a future week. But here, the law is king, and that makes God king. Sometimes we speak about that in our nation, although we don't mean it, we are a nation of laws. A government of laws, not a government of men. Well, ideally, when people first started saying that, they had some inkling of where that came from. And then less and less and less and less as truth was reduced to the mob. But so the way of kings in verses 11 through 18 is not restricted to Saul. It describes also an objective way. It is true that he says the way of this king. Some people can look at this and say, well, Saul was just a really, really bad guy. Well, indeed, he was a bad guy. What, unlike you, if you had some power? But he was, remember how he started out. He was tall. He was handsome. Why'd they pick him? Well, because he had an R next to his name and he wore a cowboy hat. And so he's one of us. That's why they picked him. Hey, let's bring this down to the present day, people. He's one of us. He's got an R next to his name. He wears a cowboy hat. He's one of us. I'm so glad our close neighbors would never do a thing like that and out of the other side of their mouth pretend to be Christian and care about God's law. Cowboy hat. R on it. Taco Tuesday. That's what you get with the mob. That's the rule of man as opposed to the rule of law. And so if you think, well, it's just a coincidence that one led to the other, or it's just Saul, or that he took those taxes and took your daughters and all those different things. No, it is the way of kings. The opposite of the way of law is the way of the kings in that sense. Let's look briefly at some sins. So as we look at the kings, pagan and those of Israel, we see that they sin in the whole law. Remember the first table, second table of the law? And those are connected in the history of Israel. And it's not just in the history of Israel. I show you secular examples of people breaking these laws. There was Jeroboam the first, when the nation first divided, and he was the northern kingdom. And God set him up there, and he was going to take over because the house of David and Solomon had failed and so on, and Rehoboam was just this bum that came in there and just got on Twitter and started bragging about how he's going to just smoke these people in the street and all that stuff. That's almost literally what happened. His advisors were bad. And God judged him, and he gave the kingdom to someone else. And what does this guy Jeroboam do right away? He sets up altars at Bethel and Dan. Why does he do that? He does that because he's afraid that Jerusalem was the center of worship. And Deuteronomy said that that's the place I want you to worship. But if that's the place that is the religious center, that's going to be where all the power is politically too. Judah's going to have all the power. So even though he had all these tribes and all this land, he said, I got to do something about that. What did he do? He used religion for political purposes. All of a sudden, that's not just Israel, is it? We do that. Rulers do that. And we fall for it. You just stick a microphone in somebody's face, whether they're an R or a D, and that person says, well, Jesus this. You give a Sunday school answer. He's in. Cowboy hat, and he said Jesus. He's in. We do that. We fall for it. Uzziah, he was another king of Israel, and he was basically good. But then he grew proud. 2 Chronicles 26 talks about this. He usurped the ecclesiastical office. Remember we talked about those offices, prophet, priest, king. And I told you it's going to matter even for this political power thing. And so priests, and in this case, Uzziah went into the temple to do the priest's work. The priest rose up and said, no, you can't do that. Just like we're not allowed to talk to governing authorities. No, we are, and there's countless examples throughout Scripture, Old and New Testament, in Jewish courts and in pagan courts. The examples are everywhere. This courageous man stood up there and said, no, Uzziah wasn't having it. He was going to kill him. Now, God struck him with leprosy. And so that's how that story ends. But what we see here is other offices checking power and rulers disrespecting that and not liking that. Pretty normal. Nothing conspiratorial there. Pretty normal. Let's move out to the pagans in the book of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar. You would think after Daniel read his mail a couple times that he would have just gotten the story by now. And the pagan king did a couple of things. He attempted to deprogram and to reprogram the Hebrew youth in Daniel 1. But what we know him for, most famously, is setting up that image to be worshipped. And Caesar would do that too on the coin, and that was part of what was behind that. But he set up an image to be worshipped. And again, the Hebrew boys said, no, we're not doing that. And he boasted of his glory in chapter 4, verse 29. He just kept going back to it. He just kept not learning his lesson. And we'll talk about what all these things have in common and what they show us. But there's also sins of the second table. There's sins by these officers of the second table, such that, the government, civil magistrate, he gets to decide what the second table is. Nobody would say that. But that's what we mean when we say, well, Romans 13, but my Romans 13, and you take it out of context, and we're going to correct that. We're going to set it in its context in some weeks to come. But for now, that's really what we're saying, and the Bible says otherwise. Pharaoh enslaved and further oppressed Israel in Exodus 1:11 through 14. He attempted to murder all their male offspring. What did the midwives of Egypt do? We're not doing it. I didn't say that. They deceived him. That's 2 strikes. Rahab did the same. She lied to the king. That's 2 strikes. New Testament said she did a righteous thing. No, it doesn't. It just says in Hebrews 11 she had faith. Read James 2. That's not all she had. She was also justified by her works. What work is it talking about? Well, there's only one work we know about in the Bible, and it's that one. You better reconcile that. I have. I have no problem withholding information from a bloodthirsty, murdering Nazi that comes to your door and wants to know where the Jews are. Or somebody comes to my door and says, where's your daughter? Who wants to know? You're not privy to that information. You're not in that covenant. We got a whole lot of Bible to learn here. Because the people that are teaching us these things today have no clue what they're talking about. But that's another instance of civil disobedience in those Egyptian midwives. Ahab and Jezebel. Ahab coveted the vineyard of Naboth in 1 Kings 21, 1 through 7. And Jezebel, because he was prepared to just go home and cry about it because he was a wuss. He was just going to go home and just sob. And Jezebel came in there and said, no, I'll get it for you. And she did her Jezebel thing that we all know her for. And Jezebel had the man falsely charged and stoned to death. Now, I remember, and some of you might remember this, if you watched the Focus on the Family production more than a decade ago now, called The Truth Project. And Del Tackett took everybody on a tour through various, sociology and all these different things in the Christian worldview. That was a really good production. And there were moments because he had a class in there, where there was like aha moments. There was resistance, but it was just like kind of like faces. And then, and who knows, this might have all been acted for all I know. I don't know. But there was one moment I'll never forget. And it was the one moment there was almost tension. There was this one guy, when he got to the state, and when Del Tackett told this story about Ahab and Naboth's vineyard, and he asked the question after he already told him that he killed him, and he read the story, it was unjust, and he said, "Can the state steal?" And this young man perked up the only time in the class. And when I say perked up, I mean puffed up. And he said, "Yes." And Del Tackett said, "Well, I know they can, but I mean, can they?" And the guy cut in again. Well, unfortunately, that is their prerogative. And I don't remember the exact words he used. But you cut the tension there with a knife. Somebody's God got poked. We'll talk about statism in just a second. But can the state steal? I didn't ask you if the IRS could break your legs. I asked you if it's punitive and therefore a violation of the eighth commandment. Which it clearly was, and there's nothing voluntary about it. Ahab said, "May the Lord forbid it, that I should give my inheritance." And then they took it anyway and brought up false charges. Herod, when the king realizes that Christ's rule is over his, he responds in violence in Matthew 2:16-18, which really, Acts 4, is sort of a fulfillment of Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 starts off with, "Why do the nations rage? The kings plot in vain." So all that stuff. Okay? That's what's going on when a governor says, "God didn't reduce our level of coronaviruses. We did that." That same puffy chest is a result of knowing deep down that there's a collision course between Christ's rule and their rule. So what's going on in all of this? Well, in a word, and I already brought up the word, but I'll put it on the board. Statism. Not Satanism, pretty close, but statism. Which is a species of Satanism, as we will see. But statism. And anytime you have an ism on the end of an otherwise perfectly harmless, maybe neutral word in that sense, like secularism, statism. In the fall of the image, when all that was designed, and if the image falls, then the social image falls with it and is perverted. But in the fall of the image, what we see in all those biblical stories is that there is a deifying tendency of the statesman and a totalizing tendency of the state. So the king, the way of the king, what's the way of the king? To exalt himself now above his brothers. He's above them. He's not one of them. And the law that was up here, that puts him and them under the same law, is now proceeding from him. His decrees. Not only is there a deifying tendency of the statesmen, but then a totalizing, as we saw with Ahab, knocked him out. The Hebrew boys knocked them out. What the midwife stood in the way of, the babies, knocked them out. Herod, if he could, with Jesus, knocked them out. What Adam was doing in the garden, the state takes over that. Culture, the state takes over that. A deifying tendency of the statesman and a totalizing tendency of the state. To worship the state. To have the state be for you what God was meant to be for you through having the state eat up the prerogatives of the other social spheres that are supposed to exist in harmony and balance with the civil law. And thus the statesman is no longer an officer but a rogue. And that state, no longer a government among men, but a bloodthirsty wolf pack hunting down the image of God, which is what we see in Revelation. The rule of the barbarian is the norm in Cain's line. From Lamech, you see him right after Cain. It's the idolizing and glorifying his violence, and his especially violence toward women, and his violence in general. Taking people to himself as property, he becomes a type of what is to come. All the way to Nero, the one who's called, euphemistically again, supposedly, I guess maybe because John wanted to couch that and put it in code so that Christians wouldn't get in trouble, the beast. But what is the norm in Cain's line? It's misogyny, racism, slavery, child abuse. In other words, all the things that you were taught in the plantation school system, the Bible popped out of the Bible, massaged and sprinkled on top with capitalism, but popped out of the Bible. Wrong. It existed everywhere and still does, except for in the Bible and Christian influence out of the Bible. But it's in the Bible. Yes, because, watch the flow chart, because in this long march out of barbarism, out of satanic, collectivist, anthill, bloodthirsty barbarism, where individuals had no individuality, where women were property, where children, if they were the slightest bit deformed, were thrown off a cliff, where all of that stuff still happens everywhere today, except where Christianity has influence. These things are in the line of Cain. And the Bible is stepping into that. But why didn't God end it right away? Why doesn't God end toothaches right away? In one sense, this is no more problematic than the whole problem of evil. I say toothaches, you say, oh, that's minimizing it. Fine, ratchet it up to cancer and to very serious things. This is no more difficult in that sense than the problem of evil in general. And that's something that we can answer. We have other videos that talk about that. But this idea that, yes, slavery is assumed at first, and so Abraham takes it out of Ur because he's a pagan. Not because it popped out of the Jew, but because the Jew popped out of Ur. God invented the Jew. Before that, he was Abram, the idol worshiper, who did slavery because that's what you and your friends do. It was only God's system that gave an impetus and gave you a reason in the image of God for why we're not property. Okay? So we have to set this straight, which is why, and we'll talk about all this in Exodus, how the slave trade was aimed at, and the one who kidnapped and originated it was given the death penalty. But they still had slaves. You're just not listening. And so we've got to talk about that. We've got to talk about why women have freedom and dignity and equality now. Why children are not just things that you toss over a cliff now. See, we're arguing back like a bunch of spoiled brats that know nothing about history and live in Disneyland and look at screens all day and have never cracked open a book that doesn't have pictures in it. And we look back in criticism, borrowing from the morality of this book to criticize the people in this book who are the first people who experienced that liberation because of the image of God and the truth in this book. And so we've got to set those things straight. And so we'll close with this. John picks up on Daniel's imagery, which really, remember, I told you this is a type. And then there's the antitype. There's Babel and there's Babylon. There's Nimrod in the line of Cain. And then there's the beast. And John uses Daniel's imagery in Revelation 13. This creature of Babel moves on through history, not only in the fourfold imagery of the statue that Daniel interpreted from Babylonia to Persia to Greece and Rome, but that extension of what was Roman power. To do, as John says in Revelation 13:7, to make war on the saints. But of this shadow state, the satanic state, and some people would look at it, and Greg Boyd's one of them in his books, like The Myth of a Christian Nation, and his book on evil, God, Satan, and Evil, I think is the name of it. And they would say that all government is evil. Remember what I talked about with the straight line and the crooked line? But John says something interesting in verse 2 of Revelation 13. That to this beast, the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. And that word authority is very interesting, because that's the word that Paul uses in Romans 13:1. And one of the questions I want to ask at that point is, was Paul unaware of this concept? And I don't mean hadn't he read Revelation, because Revelation's written later, even if it is written during Nero's reign instead of Domitian, even if it's early. I'm not asking that question. Is he aware of the imagery that John would borrow from, that Peter seemed to use in his letter, of Rome being euphemistically referred to as Babylon, and both being this fake state? And if so, isn't it interesting that he's writing to the church in Rome? He could have written Romans 13 to the Galatians, or the Ephesians, or the Thessalonians. He chose to write it to the Romans. I don't think that's an accident. Was Paul unaware of this concept? And my answer is, to be continued. I'm not telling you, because I want you to come back next week, where we're going to pick this up in the defense of the civil sphere. So we'll talk about that next time.